Roy for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I thank Chairman Arrington for holding this hearing. I thank the witnesses. There's a lot we could get into. I don't want to repeat what a number of my colleagues have already said. I do want to pick up, I think, on what my friend from California, Mr. McClintock, noted and just make sure that there's agreement here across the board. We talk about 10-year budget windows. We talk about these numbers. And at the end of the day, each Congress, every time we come in, we end up assuming things in the out years, and they never materialize to the benefit of taxpayers. They're to the benefit of a budget that's responsible. The reason I bring that up is what matters to me is what we do this year. And can I pose a question that's going to be fairly obvious, but I think it matters a lot. And I'm going to state something real quick. Mr. Couchman, if I remember correctly, you testified in front of the Judiciary Committee.
Yes, sir.
On a committee I chaired, the Subcommittee on the Constitution on the Balanced Budget Amendment. And one of the things that we talked about, I think you concluded, you said, which future will Congress choose, is the way you concluded that hearing. And my point would be when the majority of both parties rejected, for example, Chairman Arrington's common sense entitlement reform to fix the Social Security windfall elimination program, and instead chose a much more expensive version, we blew the lid off of the budget. Why? For political expediency. We did the same thing with respect to burn pits. Rather than adopting a responsible approach to figure out how to manage a terrible crisis for veterans that were suffering from the consequences of what they had to deal with in serving our country, we adopted a basically $600 billion new entitlement, if my numbers are correct from memory. It was a massive new entitlement. My point is just this, for every witness, Republican invited or Democrat. Debates aside about the tax policies and whether we should have lower or higher marginal rates and what that does for income and economic growth, a robust debate worth having. True or false, right now our country is on a path to absolute fiscal train wreck and bankruptcy on the back of the mandatory spending that we have put on autopilot and refused to amend or change and have not substantively amended or changed in any meaningful way, particularly the biggest drivers, Medicare, Social Security, and increasingly veterans benefits and things like what we did and created just 5 years ago with the burn pit fund. True or false? Just go down the line.
I think it's fair to say.
True.
True.
Not quite true. So the spirit of what you're saying is correct, but it's not a train wreck. In fact, it's almost even worse. It's a slow burn. It's a train that doesn't function the way it used to. As I said earlier before you came in, I don't see us having a Liz Truss moment where our creditors just stop lending to us. I see this as much more as a slow deterioration.
Okay, but I think that's arguing on the margins of something that I think is critically important for us to recognize as a Congress. Congress appears to me to be uniquely incapable of addressing this problem. And I think the question I would ask of you all is what needs to change? This has been the literal same question for my adult life. And yet we have failed completely to address it. Last year, we had a robust debate. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle say tax policy is blowing the lid off the deficits and criticize us for making reforms to Medicaid and to SNAP and to other programs. I might be willing to say we could have done some more aggressive things and figured out tax policy, right? We tried to constrain some of it here on this side. Senate made some permanent. We had to manage that across the two chambers. And we were trying to do a lot of difficult decisions to hold the line, to constrain out of control, growth projections and so forth. But it was a battle trying to balance all of that and to beg for crumbs of reforms. So my question for each one of you is 30 seconds left. Is what it is. What has to change? Give one single thing you think needs to change to force Congress and force our government to deal with the train wreck or slow burn or mixture thereof that is coming. Social Security, Medicare, everything, bankrupt, interest, 10 years of debt that we're going to refinance. $10 trillion of debt that we're going to refinance in the next year. Sir.
I think it comes down to a question of political will and the willingness to compromise across the aisle. The one time in our lifetimes, most of our lifetimes, when we've achieved balance was the result of a difficult, politically difficult compromise in a very otherwise divided Congress, where, a president had been impeached, and yet they were able to work on fiscal policy on a bipartisan basis and adopt a series of very difficult political decisions that resulted in fiscal constraint. So I think it's compromise.
Thank you, Mr. Couchman.
Congress must modernize its institutions so that the incredible talent that is in this body can address the problems facing the American people with better incentives and opportunities.
Ms. McGinnis.
I think you have to put in a default so that you've got to pick a target, a fiscal target, then you can put in annual targets, and then you need to put in a default where if you don't achieve it, some of these will happen automatically. I think we're starting to lose faith in politicians' abilities to make the choices, so we need to kind of outsource some of the harder choices if you are unable to.
Starting to lose faith, Mr. Bernstein?
Yeah, I don't.
I fear that Congress won't change until there's a massive spike in interest rates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for witnesses.
I'll yield a few minutes for myself, and we'll get back on this. So much to cover here. I really appreciate the expert witnesses here to talk about. Ms. McGinnis, you and I get a chance to connect on numerous elements. We talked about this, and you've actually talked ad nauseum about the 3% deficit, so I'm not going to bother you with entertain you another question on that. I think we've established. There was one point that's made. Mr. Bernstein mentioned, I'd love a follow-up to see how we're going to get there. So that's exactly the point, and I don't want to speak for the actual chair. I'm just the pretend chair for a moment. But that's the whole point, is we want to set a North Star. And Congress is going to go through the next decade. The Congress is going to go through whatever we go through as political seasons change and this and that. We want to set a North Star so we can find a way to get there. And so I appreciate that commentary. There is one quick point that I want to make, though, and it comes from a very sincere place, is that if you look at what took place from pre-2017 to post-2017 with FDII, let's get down into the weeds, foreign derived intangible income. Before 2017, there was an enormous amount of inversion going on. Companies were sending their revenue to tax domiciles overseas because there was a 13% rate in Ireland. So what did the U.S. do? We made our tax rate on FDII comparative. We made it competitive with other OECD countries. And what took place then? Companies repatriated their money. So post-2017, we got more revenue from corporations saying, hey, if there's a comparative tax rate, I'm going to take that and I want to put it in the U.S. every day of the week. But if there's a 3 or 4% difference, I might just establish this in Ireland. So we get more revenue when we have a lower tax rate. People aren't putting it in foreign tax domiciles. So we have to be willing to accept that. And I don't see enough from my Democrat colleagues on an understanding of that. Maybe more privately they are, but then it's always this blast of everything's causing deficits. It was not. We're raising revenues actually when we make taxes competitive. And that's an important part to make, and I'm very passionate about it. As you can tell, it's important to recognize. But the single biggest reason we are in the debt situation that we are, Mr. Couchman, is because for the last 50 years, the makeup of our spending has flipped. In 1965, over 70% of our budget was discretionary. We voted on it every year. That portion of the budget, that 70% of the budget, has not grown wildly out of control. It's grown at less than 3% over the course of those 50 years. Why? Because we vote on it every year. What's grown was in 1965, just that quarter of the budget, a few mandatory programs, has now grown to extremely high portion of the budget. It now constitutes over 77%. And within the next few years, 80% of our budget will not be voted on by Congress unless we make one change. And would you like to explain a little bit more about the Comprehensive Congressional Budget Act?
Absolutely. And the spending side is exactly as you described, and then the revenue side is entirely outside of the annual process as well. And you're absolutely right to point out that we need to be competitive internationally. We need to continually improve ourselves. We're going to fall behind, but we don't do that except in leaps and bursts every 8 or 10 years. We should be doing it every single year. And the comprehensive congressional budget is an incredible piece of legislation that you have offered that would give every committee the opportunity to manage the programs it has jurisdiction over, much like the appropriators already do. And by the way, that would help the appropriations bills succeed on time every year because so many other people would have skin in the game, would have a stake in the success of the annual process.
That's a great point that I don't think it's shared enough. All of the attention comes on the appropriations budget, and it's a dwindling portion of the overall. People back home are floored, and I got several slides on this that I show up to every meeting that I conduct back home, and I explain to folks that we have 77% of the budget that we don't vote on. It's on autopilot. It's on mandatory spending, and we're not being responsible by doing it. If we were to just force to vote on the entirety of the budget, and I would even concede in an entire cycle, so a 2-year term even. It doesn't even have to be every year. I would prefer it to be every year. But if we voted on all items of the budget, we could keep it from growing in all those specific areas from growing 12, 15%. And in that case, we wouldn't need a fiscal commission act to get our one moment. Since 1984 was the last time we made any changes to the largest spending items that we have, we wouldn't need that opportunity to do a fiscal commission act. I'm very supportive of a fiscal commission act. I think it's probably the only catalyst that will get us to get some of this under control. But this would give us an opportunity to regularly reform. You mentioned we should consider the age. For someone under 30, they shouldn't expect to be able to get Social Security, Medicare at the same exact age that my dad gets it. But guess what? We don't ever vote on it. If we did this bill, we would actually vote on these things, and we could make regular reform to these programs and keep the spending under check. And, we wouldn't have a balanced budget next year if we did this type of deal. But this is what would keep it from massively every single budget item under the autopilot situation from growing wildly out of control. Mr. Burks, I desperately wanted to ask you about healthcare spending. It's 20% of our economy. As you get more questions, please consider to jump in. It's a key aspect of it. Any quick thoughts on some of the...
If I can just add one thing in response to the point about the current process doesn't give you an opportunity to vote every year. Obviously, the budget resolution is an imperfect vehicle. It is more binding on the appropriation side than it is on the mandatory side, in as much as the appropriators have to produce a new bill each year and therefore are bound by their strictures. But it is an opportunity, and I would urge the committee to, as I noted in my testimony, get back to that regular annual adoption of a budget resolution that really does try to address all the aspects of